In this emotional journey, we will explore a seemingly insignificant story, a young woman being penalized for arriving late to court. But within minutes, this case transforms into a pivotal moment that forces the entire legal system to reflect on itself. The judge believes he is teaching a young girl a lesson. What he doesn't know is that the person standing before him is a self-taught legal genius, once the spokesperson for the White House, and with every word she speaks, the very authority in that courtroom begins to crumble. Stay tuned until the end, because what happens next isn't just an act of defiance. It marks the beginning of a reform no one saw coming. The first light of day gently filtered through the curtains, casting soft golden streaks across the wooden floor. In the neat and quiet kitchen, Caroline Furrow carefully poured coffee into an off-white porcelain mug, her other hand flipping through a stack of paperwork filled with tiny, dense text. Every motion she made was steady, precise, as though her mind had already been programmed for an ordinary morning. Just a small matter, a procedural day. She wasn't dressed too formally, wearing a navy blazer, a white shirt, and black trousers, just the right amount of seriousness without being overly showy. Her blonde hair was tied back loosely, and her sharp eyes radiated the quiet confidence she was known for. For Caroline Furrow, today was just about defending justice for her family, a misunderstood trucking contract, some mismatched payment details. She had reviewed the files 3 times, even snapped pictures of the receipts, marking the line numbers. There was nothing to worry about, and she was sure that if she presented it clearly, everything would be wrapped up quickly, probably in 20 minutes, at most 30. Taking a sip of her hot coffee, she glanced into the mirror across from the dining table. A brief moment of silence. There she saw herself, Caroline Furrow, 27 years old, stepping out from the shadow of doubt to become the youngest press secretary in the history of the Trump administration. She had stood strong through countless intense press briefings, facing off with veteran national media personalities. And today, it was just a small-town court. Piece of cake, she whispered to herself. On the table lay her BMW key, a reward she had gifted herself after the 2020 campaign. Caroline Furrow grabbed it, stepping outside into the pale morning light. The sky above was unusually clear, without a cloud in sight. No wind, just like the stillness before a storm no one knew was coming. The car started up smoothly. She switched on NPR out of habit, listening to the morning news. The announcer's voice came on, steady, reporting, "Controversy surrounding the Gulf of America executive order intensifies as lawmakers react strongly." Caroline furrowed her brow but kept her hands firmly on the wheel. She already knew about it because she had written the media response for the president. But today, she wasn't Caroline Furrow of the White House. Today, she was Caroline Furrow, the daughter of a middle-class family, protecting her parents from an unnecessary service error. Yet, deep in her chest, a strange unease began to rise. Vague, almost like a cold underground stream running beneath what seemed to be stable ground. A fragile intuition that something today was off, but she couldn't quite put her finger on it. And for Caroline Furrow, everything had to be clear, grounded in facts. Instinct wasn't enough to make her stop. The ringtone echoed through the quiet space of the car. The screen lit up with a clear message from Daniel Ashton, a senior WH advisor. Caroline immediately felt her spine stiffen, a reflex. She was no stranger to Daniel. The White House senior advisor never called unless something was wrong, especially not at this hour, especially not when she was heading into what seemed like a routine court session. She pressed the answer button, trying to keep her voice steady. "Caroline here." Daniel's voice came through the car speakers, low and fast, but filled with tension. "I'm sorry to disturb you this early, but there's a big issue. The media is going crazy over the Gulf of America executive order. A slew of lawmakers have started speaking out against it. The president wants a written response as soon as possible, before noon." Caroline closed her eyes for a brief second. She knew this wasn't just about writing a simple response. This was a political firefight where every word could either spark or calm a storm of opposition, and she was the one responsible. "Did you send the materials? Sending them now? Can you start drafting a response? I'm on my way to court, but I'll handle it as soon as I stop." "Don't worry." She hung up, took a deep breath, and tried to steady her rapidly beating heart. The NPR broadcast continued, but Caroline Furrow wasn't listening anymore. Her mind was split into 2 branches. One branch worried about the civil dispute, facing a judge she had never met in a town court that wasn't accustomed to people like her with political connections. The other branch was calculating every line of response for an executive order that could shake the government if mishandled. She needed legal language, precise but flexible enough to avoid stirring up more opposition. The car turned onto a small street, and she quickly pulled into a parking lot next to a nameless coffee shop. Without wasting time, Caroline Furrow pulled her laptop from her bag, connected to Wi-Fi through her phone, and began working right from the steering wheel. Beside her was the family lawsuit file, now ironically her second priority. The laptop screen lit up. An email from Daniel had arrived. She opened the first file, a detailed analysis of 15 hostile questions from the media, including top opposition newspapers. Each question was like a bullet aimed straight at the heart of the executive order. Why change the name of such a historically significant body of water? What legal grounds are there for this? Is this just a distraction tactic? Caroline quietly opened a new tab and began typing. She knew she had less than 30 minutes if she wanted to make it to court on time. Her fingers moved swiftly over the keyboard. Her gaze focused entirely. She analyzed each question, pulled up legal data from the White House digital library she had downloaded, and connected each argument to the content of the order, all written with the precision of a seasoned lawyer. Time seemed to warp. When she glanced at the clock on the car screen, it read 8:52 a.m. The court session started at 9 o'clock, and she was still at least 10 minutes away. Her heart raced. For someone else, this might have been an accident, but for her, it was a double test. Could she uphold her national responsibilities without abandoning her personal duty? She quickly called Daniel back. I've handled 70%. Here's the preliminary strategy. It includes a legal argument on sovereignty, citing precedents on naming geographical areas, and emphasizing its symbolic significance within the national context. I'll send the complete version after I'm done at court. Daniel let out a quiet sigh of relief. Thank you, Caroline Furrow. I really don't know anyone else who could handle this. She didn't respond. She simply closed the laptop, started the car, and drove off in silence. Outside the window, the sky remained unnaturally clear, but inside her, two storms were quietly forming, one in politics and one in justice, and she was being pulled into both at the same time, not knowing that the second battle would ultimately redefine her entire identity in the eyes of America. The laptop snapped shut, and Caroline Furrow barely had time to take another sip of her coffee. She stowed the laptop, double-checked the family lawsuit files, started the car, and sped out of the small parking lot beside the coffee shop. The clock on the dashboard blinked 8:54 a.m. 7 minutes. She had exactly 7 minutes to get to the Plastow Town Court, and she knew 7 minutes in rush hour on this town's roads was never a true 7 minutes. The main road to the courthouse was narrow, with two notoriously slow traffic lights. She had never been late, never, and the thought of it left her throat dry. The BMW zoomed down the road, but not fast enough to break the speed limit. Caroline Furrow bit her lip, her eyes locked on the steering wheel. Small buildings, convenience stores, and gas stations passed by the window. Everything was calm, slow, while inside the car, her mind raced between two fronts, politics and law. She mentally ran through the arguments for the family lawsuit, which involved a contract that specified regular payments, but the invoice from the opposing party stated a one-time payment, a clear contradiction. She had photos, emails, and confirmation from a former employee on their side. But right now, all that reasoning seemed strangely insignificant because something was wrong. She felt it clearly, not just because she was running late, not just because she was handling a media crisis for the White House from a small parking lot, but because something was waiting for her at that courthouse, something that wasn't in any of the plans. As the car turned onto the main road leading to the courthouse, a truck suddenly swerved out from an intersection, forcing her to slam on the brakes. The driver waved an apology, and Caroline Furrow just nodded, not reacting. She didn't have time for anger. She glanced at the clock, 8:59, 1 minute. She pressed the accelerator, and within her, a feeling of tightness began to rise, not from fear of being late, but because she had a gut feeling that today wasn't just a simple contract hearing. When the Plastow Town Court came into view, she slowed down, turned into the parking lot to the right where only one spot remained. She parked quickly, grabbed her file, and checked her phone one last time. There was a message from Daniel. Your notes are perfect. I'll send the final version with your edits to POTUS. You saved the morning again. She smiled faintly, but only for a second, because right after, her gaze shifted toward the courthouse steps. Ordinary people, farmers, Workers, small business owners were stepping in with tense expressions. And this time, Caroline Furrow realized she wasn't like them. She was an outsider, a person stepping in with neat blonde hair tied back, a tailored blazer, and a perfectly organized file. She was a young woman, one who had been on national television. And it was this very difference, though unspoken, that would lead her to face a trial where justice wasn't static like it seemed on paper. She walked quickly into the main hall, the sound of her footsteps echoing off the old tiled floors. The smell of printer ink, paper, and cold coffee filled the air, the familiar atmosphere of any town court. But today, that space seemed heavier than usual. She checked the time again, 9:03 a.m., 3 minutes late, a small number, but enough to set off a chain of events no one expected. And Caroline Furrow, with all her confidence, strength, and logic, had no idea that those 3 minutes would make her the center of the most violent storm of her life. On the second floor of the Plasto Town Court, inside courtroom number 3, a man in a black robe flipped through documents with an expressionless face. His eyes behind silver-rimmed glasses quickly scanned the text, stopping only for the faintest of furrows on his brow, as if each word were being interrogated by him. Judge Edward Grayson, 62, had sat in the judge's seat for over 3 decades, and everyone in Plasto Town knew his name. They called him Grayson of the Law, not because he was so skilled that the law followed him, but because he believed that the law had no exceptions. To him, order was sacred. Punctuality, being on time, was the bare minimum of morality. Anyone, from petty thieves to Harvard-educated lawyers, who dared to be late would feel the cold sting of his voice. Grayson was not the type to shout or slam his fist on the table. He didn't need to. The coldness in his gaze, the way he read someone's name with a tone as sharp as a blade, was enough to silence the room. Someone said Judge Grayson doesn't need a gavel. His voice is the gavel. The courtroom floor was polished. A black and white portrait of past judges hung behind him like silent witnesses to every decision. And today, as usual, he began his morning with a cup of hot Earl Grey tea placed neatly at his left hand. Never coffee. Coffee made people quick to anger. As for him, he needed clarity to see every subtle sign of disrespect slowly rise in a glance, posture, or 1 minute late. Below, the townspeople began settling into their seats. The long wooden benches creaked lightly as they shifted. Everyone was dressed neatly, slightly wrinkled shirts, old office skirts, outdated suits. But no one dared to dress sloppily in courtroom number 3. They knew the unspoken rule here. Beside the judge's bench was Robert Hayes, the judicial officer overseeing the session. He had worked with Judge Grayson for over 15 years, and while he had grown accustomed to Grayson's cold demeanor, there were still moments when he felt a chill down his spine watching Grayson take action. He wasn't biased, but he did have selectivity. Those who were young or displayed too much confidence were often seen as disrespectful, and Grayson did not tolerate disrespect in his courtroom. At the clerk's desk was Margaret Evans, a middle-aged woman with silver hair and hands that always tapped the keys with steady rhythm. She had been transcribing every session of Grayson's for 12 years, and though no one knew, in her drawer was a personal notebook where she quietly recorded the times Grayson imposed exceptionally harsh judgments. No one had asked her to do it, but over time, she began to notice something unjust repeating. 9 a.m. on time, Grayson murmured, glancing at his watch, then looking up at the list of defendants. And then, the courtroom door softly creaked open. Grayson lifted his head, his eyes as sharp as a blade, locking directly onto the person who had just entered, a young woman wearing a blue blazer, her blonde hair tied back neatly, a file in her hand. Her face was not fearful. She simply nodded quietly to the bailiff, then quickly took her seat. The door behind Caroline Furrow hadn't even fully clicked shut when a voice rang out across the courtroom, deliberate, slow, but sharp enough to slice through the tension in the air like a knife. Miss Caroline Furrow stepped forward. Caroline froze. She hadn't expected her name to be called so quickly, not before she had even had the chance to assess the room or understand who exactly was presiding over her case. She hadn't even had a moment to steady her nerves or absorb the weight of the atmosphere around her. But then, that voice had struck her with such chilling authority that she knew instantly this wasn't going to be just any court hearing. This wasn't a simple contract dispute. This was something far more intense, far more dangerous. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself, and began walking toward the witness stand. The sound of her heels striking the polished wood floor echoed through the otherwise silent room, each step seemingly more magnified than the last. Every sound seemed to reverberate like the ticking of a clock, marking the passage of time in a courtroom where every second felt like an eternity. It was as if the world was holding its breath, waiting for her to make the smallest mistake. Judge Grayson, his face set in stone, finally lifted his gaze from the papers on the desk. His eyes, sharp and cold, locked onto hers with an intensity that made her heart skip a beat. There was no warmth, no kindness. There was only judgment. He didn't glance at the file before him. He didn't ask any questions about the dispute, the specifics of the case, or the facts. He looked only at her, and then at the clock, his piercing gaze cutting through the air as though he was stripping away every layer of her being. You were summoned at 9 o'clock. It's now 9:03. Do you believe that's acceptable in a courtroom? The words hit her like a punch to the gut. She stood there, still as a statue, holding the file in her hands, trying to keep her composure intact. Her voice, though steady, betrayed the slightest tremor as she began to speak. Your Honor, I apologize for being late. I had some unforeseen delays, but before she could finish, Judge Grayson cut her off, his voice as cold as ice and just as unyielding. No excuses. His hand flicked dismissively, as though brushing away a fly. I've heard every excuse in the book during my 30 years of service. Traffic, illness, storms, children, even lost phones. He paused for a moment, his eyes narrowing as if he were contemplating something, and then his tone dropped even lower, colder, almost dripping with disdain. But you walk in here as if your tardiness is some insignificant detail. The room fell into a tense silence. The onlookers, those who had been quietly settling in their seats moments ago, now sat frozen, eyes fixed on Caroline Furrow. Some had arrived late themselves, a few even after her, but none of them had been called out. None of them had been reprimanded. Only Caroline Furrow, she, young, well-dressed, confident, and standing out. Grayson's voice dropped even further, almost a whisper, but his words sank deep, each syllable cutting through her like a blade. This is not a press conference in Washington, D.C. You cannot stroll into this courtroom as though you're in charge of a television program. Caroline stood there, her back straight, her gaze steady, her hands gripping the folder in front of her. Her heart was pounding in her chest, and she could feel the sweat beginning to form on the back of her neck. She had been prepared for many things, but this wasn't it. Your Honor, I didn't mean to come across that way, and I sincerely regret being late, she tried again, her voice still calm, though now tinged with the frustration of being interrupted. But before she could finish, Grayson's gavel slammed down onto the wooden desk with a sharp, resounding crack that reverberated through the room. You're fine. $500 for your blatant disregard of court rules. A sharp, collective intake of breath filled the room. The tension was palpable. Someone in the back muttered in disbelief, and even Margaret Evans, the court secretary who had transcribed countless proceedings for over a decade, paused in her typing and glanced at Grayson, a confused look in her eyes. A $500 fine for a few minutes of tardiness? This was unheard of. This wasn't the normal course of business in this courtroom. The punishment didn't fit the infraction. Robert Hayes, the court officer, stood nearby, his arms crossed and his eyes narrowed in thought. He'd witnessed many of Grayson's harsh rulings over the years, but this felt different. The men and women who had come before her, late by minutes just like Caroline Furrow, hadn't faced this. Two middle-aged men, a woman much older than Caroline Furrow, they'd all either received a mild reminder or a simple warning. But Caroline Furrow, she was being singled out, treated as an example, as though she were a rookie being put in her place for the first time. Caroline didn't flinch. She didn't speak up in protest. She didn't tremble in fear. But something inside her stirred, a quiet, unspoken rebellion. Something was building behind her calm exterior. She stood there still, and she held his gaze, her mind working furiously, processing the injustice unfolding before her. Grayson, seeing her silence, thought he had broken her. He assumed he had humbled her, that she would bow to the weight of his authority. He nodded coldly, turned his attention to the case file in front of him, ready to proceed with the next case. But in that very moment, Caroline Furrow made a decision, one that would change everything. She would not remain silent, not for her reputation, not for self-preservation, but because the injustice was too blatant, too raw, and far too brutal for anyone else in that room to stand against it. And as the moments ticked by, Caroline Furrow knew that the only person who could challenge it was her. The courtroom remained silent, the eyes of everyone fixed on Caroline Furrow. The weight of Judge Grayson's gaze felt like it was pressing down on her, each passing second like another sentence being handed down. His words still echoed in the air, sharp and oppressive. $500 for your disregard of court rules. But what truly made Caroline Furrow's throat tighten wasn't the fine. What made her heart feel suffocated was the gaze of everyone around her, the people still sitting there quietly, but unable to mask their dissatisfaction. She wasn't the only one who had been late. There were 3 other people, all middle-aged men dressed as neatly as she was, and all of them had arrived later than she did. But they weren't called out. They weren't humiliated. They received nothing more than a quick glance from Grayson and were allowed to proceed as if nothing had happened. No fines, no lesson delivered like it had been for her. Caroline wasn't blind to the stark difference in Grayson's treatment of her. Suddenly, she caught the glance of the woman sitting next to Margaret Evans, the one hunched over, absorbed in her notes. Her eyes briefly flicked to Caroline Furrow with an expression of sympathy, but the moment Caroline Furrow looked back, that glance was quickly concealed, as if the woman had realized she was being seen. The whole room felt like it was holding its breath, watching a game that wasn't fair, where everyone knew the outcome, but no one dared to speak up. Grayson didn't stop. He dragged the humiliation on, speaking in even more forceful terms about the importance of discipline, about order in the courtroom. The more he spoke, the more his words became relentless. Now, he seemed almost self-righteous, as if the punishment was necessary to maintain his grip on power. As he spoke, Caroline Furrow felt a deep bitterness swell inside her, not because he was a judge, but because of the way he looked at her, as if she were someone unworthy of standing on equal ground with him. "I've warned you before," Grayson continued, his voice sharp. "This is not a press conference. You cannot treat this place like it's some place where you can show up late, as if you're giving a speech." Then, as if dismissing her entirely, he turned his attention to his secretary, continuing the day's work without sparing another glance at Caroline Furrow. It was as if, to him, the insult he delivered was final, as if he had succeeded in putting her in her place. Caroline stood still, saying nothing more, but inside, something stirred. It wasn't anger. It was a sense of powerlessness, of frustration so overwhelming that it felt suffocating. She knew she wasn't the only one being mistreated in that courtroom, and it was the silence, the quiet resignation of the people sitting in those wooden benches that was the clearest evidence of the silent injustice that had festered for far too long. The audience began to stir. Some exchanged glances, others sighed. A few eyes couldn't hide their confusion. They knew the bias, but none of them dared to speak out. Caroline felt the gaze of an elderly man at the back of the room, someone who appeared too weak to stand, hunched over with shaking hands. His gaze was not one of judgment but of profound empathy, but he, too, could only look. He could not speak, because if he did, he would be pulled into a confrontation he, too, didn't want to face. The silence that enveloped the room wasn't just fear. It was the familiarity of something that had been happening for years. As Caroline Furrow made her way down from the witness stand, a young man sitting near the gallery stood up, his eyes locked on Grayson, filled with frustration. There was something in his gaze, anger, discontent, like a flicker of light in a world consumed by darkness. Caroline Furrow noticed it, that silent acknowledgement. Though no words were spoken, they all felt something wasn't right in the way Grayson had treated her. And that was when she began to understand that she wasn't alone in this fight. Caroline stood motionless, her eyes fixed on Judge Grayson as he continued his decisive judgment. She could feel the anger simmering inside her, but she refused to let that emotion show. Her slender fingers gripped the file tightly, flipping through its pages as though she were preparing for a battle, one that she would ultimately win. It wasn't the fine that bothered her. She couldn't care less about the $500 fine, even though it was one of the highest penalties Grayson had ever handed out for something as trivial as arriving late. What truly caught her attention was how Grayson chose to treat her. She, a young woman standing confidently in the room, was the only one publicly humiliated like this. The others, the men who had arrived late before her, were not humiliated. The middle-aged men dressed just as neatly as she was were shown some understanding, but she, the young woman who was only a few minutes late, was treated like an audacious criminal, as if she had committed something far worse. She could feel the bias in every word Grayson uttered. Each sentence felt like a slap, and she was determined not to let it go unanswered. The courtroom remained dead silent, the only sound being the faint tapping of Grayson's gavel as he moved on to the next case. But Caroline Furrow no longer felt like a defeated person. She was a warrior standing in the heart of the enemy camp, waiting for the perfect moment to strike back. She quietly pulled out her phone, opened the Notes app, and began documenting every detail that she would later use as evidence. Every word Grayson spoke, each of his arrogant gestures, each act of bias. She meticulously recorded everything. To anyone who didn't see the injustice, it might have looked like a young woman who didn't understand the protocol. But Caroline Furrow, in this moment, was no longer just someone being fined. She was someone standing up for justice. This courtroom is not a place where you can treat time lightly. Grayson's voice rang out again from the bench. She didn't rush to respond. Instead, she kept writing silently, noting every word he said, capturing each moment of his bias as he continued to expose his true nature. Her eyes briefly scanned the room. The people in the courtroom didn't speak, but Caroline Furrow could feel their discomfort. Some of them averted their gaze, others clenched their jaws. A middle-aged man, sitting a few rows away, looked at her briefly with a sympathetic glance. Caroline Furrow realized that in this moment, she wasn't the only one who felt the injustice. The whole room could feel it, but only she was brave enough to stand and document it. Grayson continued, his voice colder, more pointed. You're not the only one with things to do, but you're the only one who doesn't understand that this courtroom demands absolute respect. She didn't respond, silently jotting down his words, documenting every moment of favoritism Grayson failed to see. Time in the courtroom seemed to slow down. The sound of Grayson's gavel echoed through the quiet space like a persistent heartbeat, but Caroline Furrow heard nothing but the scratching of her pencil on paper. Everything else seemed to fade into the background. She had mastered her emotions, and now she would not allow Judge Grayson or anyone in that room to continue disrespecting her. Every small detail would have value, and she would hold on to all of it, every word, every action, every decision. When Judge Grayson finally glanced her way, Caroline Furrow didn't hastily rise to her feet. She maintained her strong, composed posture, holding her file, her eyes locked onto his. No fear, only calm, unwavering strength. Everything was changing, and this time, she would not let a single ounce of bias cloud the path to justice. The courtroom felt quieter than ever, but in Caroline Furrow's mind, each sigh from those around her rang like an echo that couldn't be erased. She was no longer just a defendant. She was no longer simply a young woman late for a family lawsuit. She stood in the heart of the courtroom, facing the injustice that everyone present could clearly feel. As Grayson continued reading out her sentence, Caroline Furrow no longer felt humiliated. Instead, she sensed that it was he who was degrading the very essence of justice. But she wasn't the only one noticing it. The people in the room, too, were beginning to realize the truth. The first gaze she caught was from Margaret Evans, the court secretary. No longer was she hunched over scribbling notes as she usually did. Instead, Margaret's eyes were lifted, filled with hesitation and discomfort, only to quickly look away when she realized Caroline Furrow was staring at her. But in that brief moment, Caroline Furrow saw it clearly. The secretary couldn't deny the evident bias Grayson had shown toward her. She looked back up at Judge Grayson, her eyes sharp with determination. Grayson was oblivious, but the fairness he once prided himself on was slowly slipping away from him. As he droned on about order and discipline, Caroline Furrow felt a subtle shift in the atmosphere of the courtroom. But it wasn't just Margaret. The court officer, standing by the door, keeping a watchful eye on the proceedings, couldn't help but notice either. Caroline Furrow felt his gaze as he glanced at her while she walked, not with suspicion, but with silent empathy. He stood still, watching her pass by with a look that was almost unfamiliar to him. She understood. Even these people, those who were just doing their job, couldn't ignore the wrongness in the way Grayson had treated her. Then there was a quiet voice from someone else in the room, a middle-aged man seated behind her. She couldn't make out the exact words he spoke, but the disdain in his eyes was unmistakable. His gaze locked onto Grayson as he continued his speech about discipline and responsibility. Caroline Furrow didn't need words to understand. His look spoke volumes. Every small detail could no longer be overlooked. It was clear now. Caroline Furrow wasn't the only one feeling the injustice. The deeper, more profound injustice she was facing wasn't just the fine. It was the blatant favoritism, the discrimination against her simply because she was young, a woman, someone not part of the system. She stood still, but inside, each word of Grayson's judgment felt like a wave pushing her forward. She was no longer just a defendant. She had become a living witness, a witness to the injustice that was seeping from those in power, from those who were supposed to uphold the law. She wasn't just standing up for herself. She was a symbol for everyone who had been mistreated in the shadows of this system. When Grayson finished reading her sentence and looked at her, he didn't see defeat. He saw only a young woman standing tall with her head held high, and he had no idea that he had just paved the way for her to become a winner. Though no one knew it yet, Caroline Furrow would not simply endure this injustice. She would turn it into the fuel to change everything. And now, all those who had witnessed what happened in that courtroom, though they didn't speak, would never forget the image of the young woman standing silent, refusing to accept that injustice. She had become a symbol for all those who had been overlooked, oppressed, and misjudged in this system. Caroline stood still for a moment, her eyes still fixed on Judge Grayson, clearly feeling that this silence wasn't surrender. She was not the type to be crushed by unjust judgments, not when she had stronger tools to defend herself and perhaps even change the situation. Judge Grayson's gaze remained sharp, but he didn't notice the shift in Caroline Furrow's demeanor. To him, she was still the young woman, the one who was late, and that alone was enough for him to pass judgment. But inside Caroline Furrow, her tolerance had run out. She felt the gaze of Margaret Evans, the court secretary, watching her from the corner of the room, and she also noticed the court officer, someone she knew wasn't just there to carry out security, also casting a quiet, scrutinizing glance in her direction. They didn't say anything, but Caroline Furrow could see that even they didn't agree with how Grayson was treating her. Caroline didn't rush to stand. She simply lifted her file slowly, as if preparing for an unavoidable battle. And as she opened the file, she felt the sudden stillness that overtook the room. No one spoke, but everyone felt that something monumental was about to happen. At that moment, Caroline Furrow turned to face Judge Grayson once again, her gaze calm but filled with resolve. "Your Honor," she began, her voice clear, without a trace of fear. "I am Caroline Furrow, the White House press secretary. I would like to make it clear that I am not someone lacking knowledge of legal matters. What is happening here today is not a coincidence. It is a clear manifestation of bias." The entire room went dead silent. No one had ever heard such a direct challenge from a defendant, especially not from a young woman who had only come in to resolve a simple family lawsuit. Caroline didn't stop. She opened her file further, flipping to the pages she had marked earlier. Every legal precedent she had prepared was now being laid out logically, with no hint of anxiety. Here are clear legal precedents regarding the handling of contract disputes. She pointed to the documents in her hand, emphasizing each word. Under Section 12 of the Federal Civil Code, if the parties involved in a contract fail to adhere to payment terms due to an internal procedural mistake, it cannot be considered a violation. I have all the evidence to support this mistake, and I will not accept being fined on unjust grounds. Grayson watched her, still maintaining his stern expression, but in his eyes, there was a flicker of uncertainty, despite his attempt to suppress it. For the first time in the entire trial, Grayson realized that the person standing before him was not a naive young woman who didn't understand the law. "Can you elaborate on why you believe you were treated unfairly?" Grayson asked, his voice hoarse, as if he was testing whether Caroline Furrow could continue her argument more forcefully. Caroline didn't hesitate. "Your Honor, I'm not just talking about the fine. I'm talking about how I've been treated differently from the others in this courtroom simply because I'm young, because I'm a woman, and because I arrived late by a few minutes. Others who arrived late were given no reprimand, not even a comment. But me? I was called out, humiliated in front of everyone. That bias is undeniable." She paused, letting her words sink into the now silent space. This time, it wasn't just Grayson, but everyone in the room who was listening intently. Judge Grayson, seemingly starting to feel the tension in the air, took a deep breath and looked at her once more. His gaze remained cold, but there was now a hint of confusion, as if for the first time, he was questioning whether he had been truly fair in his decision. Caroline didn't let his confusion deter her. She had prepared everything to face this moment, and now was the time she couldn't back down. "I request the court to revoke this fine, and I request an independent investigation into the discriminatory actions I've witnessed during this trial." Her voice lowered, but every word she spoke was as sharp as a blade. "I am not standing here just to defend my personal interests. I am standing here for everyone who has been treated unfairly by this system, and I will not remain silent." The courtroom was utterly still. No one dared to move. It felt as though the entire space had returned to Caroline Furrow, the defendant who had now become the person standing up for justice. Grayson looked at her, silent, but this time his gaze was no longer cold and judgmental as before. Caroline Furrow knew, even though it wasn't over, she had made a mark that would never fade from the minds of all those who had witnessed this moment. Caroline stood firm at the witness stand, her gaze never leaving Judge Grayson. The courtroom seemed to freeze in time. The sound of the court secretary's pen, the soft tap of the gavel on the wooden table, all of it stopped in an instant. Every eye was fixed on her, and the tension in the air thickened with each passing second. She didn't speak again. There was no need. Her words had already been powerful enough to change the entire atmosphere of the courtroom. She hadn't just spoken up. She had used her calm composure and sharp reasoning to force everyone, from the judge to the onlookers, to confront the injustice they had been too afraid to face. Judge Grayson, who had sat in the judge's seat for over 3 decades, a man whom many saw as the embodiment of authority and law, now stood frozen, unsure of how to respond. His eyes darted briefly over Caroline Furrow, then back down to the case file, as though searching for a reason to counter her. But there was no reason. There was nothing he could say to justify his bias. The atmosphere in the room was so heavy, Caroline Furrow could almost hear her own heartbeat pounding in her chest. Everyone could feel the shift, but no one dared to speak up. They just stood there, silent, watching. Some exchanged glances. Others pressed their lips tight. One middle-aged man, sitting a few rows behind her, stole a sympathetic glance in her direction. Caroline Furrow understood in that moment. Even those in the room, even those simply doing their jobs, could not ignore the wrongness in Grayson's treatment of her. Judge Grayson, a man who had grown accustomed to shutting down arguments with his unyielding power, was now rendered speechless. For the first time in his career, he felt his authority being challenged in the very place he had once been proud to call his domain. A few seconds passed, and in a swift motion, Grayson slammed the gavel down onto the desk. It was a quick action, but it carried an undeniable sense of confusion. He hastily flipped through the case files as if searching for a weakness in Caroline Furrow's argument, but there was nothing. Everything was clear. She had understood it all, from the law to the precedents in the case. Caroline stood still, her expression calm, her composure unwavering. She didn't need to speak further. Her tranquility was her strongest weapon. She had used it to make Grayson realize that power was not always built on domination, but on respect for justice and fairness. Grayson, trying to shake off his disorientation, grasped the gavel again, but his hands shook. He couldn't comprehend why Caroline Furrow had dared to stand up like this, so unafraid, so resolute. What she had said wasn't the voice of a defendant. She had become the leader of this fight, a fight not just for justice for herself, but for everyone who had been suppressed by the injustice within this system. Grayson's eyes wavered, but not out of fear. It was something deeper, a recognition that something in Caroline Furrow's actions had shaken him. He was the judge, the one in control for decades, but now that power was slipping away from him. Caroline remained standing, holding her file firmly, not rushing, but each passing second felt like a bold affirmation. She was not afraid, and she would not back down. Grayson struggled to lift his gaze, but this time it was no longer filled with authority. His eyes were clouded with confusion, unsure how to handle this situation. This moment was not just shaking his confidence. It was forcing everyone in the room to reevaluate how they had perceived Caroline Furrow up until now. The entire courtroom stood in silence. No one spoke, but they all knew that today, something significant had changed. Caroline Furrow had not only stood up for herself, she had become a symbol for everyone who had been treated unfairly, and she had made the system face the things it had long sought to conceal. The tension in the courtroom continued to escalate. Caroline Furrow stood firm at the witness stand, not the slightest sign of wavering. Judge Grayson, despite his efforts to maintain his authority and dignity, no longer held the same certainty in his gaze. He realized Caroline Furrow wasn't like the other defendants who simply wanted to resolve their case and leave. She was someone standing up for justice. Your Honor, I do not ask for this fine to be revoked because of my position, nor because I am the White House press secretary. I ask for justice. Her voice was firm, unwavering. Each word she spoke felt like a slap in the face to those who had lived in a system of injustice. Caroline Furrow wasn't just looking to escape the fine. She wanted to see real change in how cases were handled here. She wanted Judge Grayson and the entire court system to face the truth. No one is above the law, Judge Grayson. I refuse to be spared simply because of my power. I demand the court initiate an independent investigation into the bias and discrimination witnessed in this courtroom. She paused, locking eyes with Judge Grayson. No one in this courtroom had ever dared to request an investigation into a judge, the one holding the highest authority in the room. But Caroline Furrow did. The people around her began to notice the difference in how Caroline Furrow faced Judge Grayson. She didn't beg for mercy. She didn't cower or plead. She stood tall, making a rightful demand. True justice, not justice shaped by favoritism. Judge Grayson sat back, his face stiffened. He never imagined that in his lifetime as a judge, he would be challenged in his own courtroom by someone he never thought would dare to confront him this way. Silence. The air in the courtroom now felt like it was being torn apart by Caroline Furrow's demands. But the silence didn't last long. The people in the room began to feel the shift, sensing that Caroline Furrow was not only speaking for herself, but for everyone who had been wronged here. A middle-aged man sitting near the back of the room began to nod. At first, it was a small movement, then a more deliberate and clear nod. Caroline Furrow didn't know who he was, but the look in his eyes was unmistakable, a clear sign of approval. He saw himself in her words. He had faced Grayson's bias before, but no one had dared to speak up. He could not remain silent any longer. He spoke. "You're right. We can't stay silent anymore." His words served as a signal, sparking others to follow. The people around began to whisper to one another, no longer afraid. A middle-aged woman sitting next to him began to tear up. She remembered the time she had been mistreated in this very courtroom, looked down upon by Grayson simply because she didn't hold power. The old memories, the pain, were still fresh in her mind, and Caroline Furrow had given her a reason to believe that this injustice could be changed. "You've spoken for us," the woman sobbed. "I was fine for being late, but I never felt I was treated like this, as though I didn't deserve to be treated fairly." Some others nodded in agreement, no longer able to hide their empathy. They began to acknowledge the injustice they had faced in this very courtroom. Each word from Caroline Furrow wasn't just her own protest, but the voice for hundreds, thousands who had been wronged here. Caroline looked at them, her eyes unwavering. She wasn't just standing up for herself. She had become a symbol for those who had been oppressed, overlooked by this system. She could feel the encouraging gazes from those around her. They weren't just watching her. They were hoping for change. She didn't know where this would lead, but she was certain of one thing. Today, in this courtroom, she had opened a door that others were too afraid to open. Immediately after the trial, Caroline Furrow's story started spreading at an astonishing rate. A short video showing the pivotal moment when she stood up and demanded justice was shared by witnesses on social media, and within hours, it had gone viral. The hashtag #LegalGenius began trending across Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Young people, women who had faced injustice, and even legal professionals began to voice their support for Caroline Furrow. Under every post, there were thousands of comments, shares, and calls for a reinvestigation into the cases that Judge Grayson had presided over. Some people shared personal stories about how they had been discriminated against in Grayson's courtroom, and for the first time, they felt that they were not alone in their battle against injustice. They found strength in Caroline Furrow's defiance, in her refusal to accept the bias she had encountered. This momentum quickly caught the attention of the media. Journalists from major networks, including CNN, NBC, and Fox, reached out to Caroline Furrow, requesting interviews. The story of a young woman daring to stand up against a powerful, long-standing figure in the legal world was nothing short of inspiring. It captured the imagination of the nation, resonating with so many who had witnessed or been victims of similar injustices. Caroline Furrow wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She had become a beacon of hope for all those oppressed within the system. The press covered her story relentlessly, broadcasting updates on her challenge to Grayson, a man who had ruled over the courtroom with unchecked authority for decades. News outlets around the country began running special reports, highlighting how one single act of courage from an ordinary citizen could challenge the foundations of an entire legal system. As Caroline Furrow's profile soared, public figures and even politicians began to take note. Some began calling her a hero. Others, perhaps out of fear of what her rise represented, questioned her motives. But regardless of the mixed opinions, it was undeniable that Caroline Furrow's actions had ignited a nationwide conversation about power, justice, and equality. The next turning point in the story came from an unexpected source, Margaret Evans, the court secretary. She had been the one person who had witnessed every action of Judge Grayson from behind the desk during her 12 years working in the courtroom. Throughout that time, she had quietly recorded every instance of bias, every discriminatory decision Grayson had made. No one ever thought that the secretary, a figure usually invisible in the grand scheme of a courtroom, would one day become the key to exposing years of wrongdoing. After the trial, Margaret could no longer remain silent. The shame and guilt of knowing she had been complicit in allowing Grayson's behavior to go unchecked weighed heavily on her conscience. She realized that she could not continue to stand by while this injustice, which she had silently documented for years, persisted. One day after the trial, Margaret made a decision that would change everything. She decided to publicly release the notes she had kept all these years. They were more than just a personal record. They were a damning account of the bias and prejudice that had permeated the courtroom. Margaret sent her meticulously documented notebook to an investigative reporter from a major news outlet with the hope that it would shed light on the dark secrets of Grayson's courtroom. When the reporter published the findings, the public was once again shocked. The notebook not only detailed numerous instances of favoritism, but also served as irrefutable proof of age, gender, and professional discrimination in Grayson's rulings. It turned out that Caroline Furrow's case was just the tip of the iceberg. For years, Grayson had been favoring certain individuals, punishing others, and manipulating the system to protect his interests. What Margaret's notes revealed was a pattern of systemic injustice that had affected countless individuals who had dared to step into that courtroom. The revelation sent shockwaves through the media. What was once considered a singular act of bravery by Caroline Furrow now evolved into a full-scale investigation into one of the most corrupt judges in the state. People who had been victims of Grayson's bias began speaking out. It became clear that Caroline Furrow's courageous stand had not only exposed a single injustice, but had sparked the beginning of a wider fight against corruption and systemic discrimination in the judicial system. The combination of Caroline Furrow's story and Margaret's documentation quickly gathered momentum, catching the attention of government officials and the judiciary system. Public outcry reached a fever pitch, with thousands of people demanding accountability for the years of unchecked bias in Grayson's courtroom. As a result, the State Judiciary Committee launched an emergency investigation into Grayson's conduct. Lawyers, former defendants, and witnesses from previous cases began to step forward, sharing their experiences of the bias they had encountered. Some reported how young defendants, women, and those who were not part of the legal profession had been punished far more severely than others. Statistical data emerged showing that these groups were disproportionately affected by Grayson's rulings. Legal experts began analyzing his decisions, pointing out numerous inconsistencies and flaws that demonstrated a clear pattern of discriminatory behavior. The push for justice was now unstoppable. The investigation revealed that Caroline Furrow's words were not merely a personal grievance, but a rallying cry for systemic reform. The State Judiciary Committee, propelled by mounting public pressure, began ordering a re-examination of the cases Grayson had presided over, with a special focus on those involving discrimination. The committee's first steps included issuing subpoenas for documents and recordings from Grayson's court and calling for testimonies from those who had been affected by his bias. In just a matter of days, law firms began receiving an overwhelming number of new cases, many of them from individuals who had previously been discouraged from seeking justice. The public now had the courage to stand up, knowing that Caroline Furrow had paved the way. Requests for retrials poured in, with people demanding the truth about Grayson's many biased decisions. This public outcry led to the formation of new coalitions, with activists, legal professionals, and ordinary citizens rallying for justice. Protests began forming outside courthouses, calling for a broader reform of the judicial system. It became clear that what had started as one woman's fight for justice had ignited a movement that would lead to major changes in the legal system. Caroline's fight was not just about her own case. It had become a powerful symbol of resistance to a broken system. She had used her voice to push back against injustice, and in doing so, she had sparked a wave of change that was reverberating across the country. The movement was now unstoppable, and it was clear that Caroline Furrow had become the catalyst for a long-overdue reform of the judicial system. As the investigation unfolded, Judge Grayson could no longer withstand the pressure. Rather than continue to defend his position of power, he chose to resign, a decision that no one had expected from a man who had long been proud of his authority on the bench for over 30 years. But instead of fading into the background, Grayson chose to return in an unexpected role. He joined a training program for young judges, focusing on bias reduction, an extraordinary and surprising turn of events. In the training sessions, Grayson shared the mistakes of his past, the painful lessons he had learned from his own biases, and the detrimental effects they had caused. He openly admitted to the destructive consequences of prejudice in the courtroom. "We cannot remain silent in the face of injustice," he said, and his words were not just an acknowledgement of his mistakes. They served as a powerful message to young judges about the importance of justice and fairness. Never before had a judge experienced such deep emotional transformation. In the process of personal change, he told the young judges, I allowed complacency to cloud my judgment. But today, I can say with pride that I've done right because I'm teaching you what I failed to do. Grayson's story became a moving and humanizing tale, showing that change is possible, even for those who had made grave mistakes. He didn't just resign. He actively took the steps to mentor young judges on how to uphold fairness and not allow personal biases to influence their decisions. His change of heart became a symbol of redemption and an example that even those who had been part of the problem could become part of the solution. From being a defendant fined for arriving late, Caroline Furrow had become a symbol of justice. No one expected that she would rise from such a position to teach at prestigious law schools, sharing invaluable lessons about justice and equality in the legal system. She was invited to teach at top universities, where she shared her story, not only about the lawsuit but also about the courage to stand up against injustice. Justice begins with the courage to stand up, no matter who you're facing, she would often say in her lectures. Caroline Furrow became a role model for thousands of students, not just in learning the law but in how to become responsible lawyers and citizens committed to justice. Her classes were always filled to capacity, not only because of the inspiring stories she brought but also because of the deep legal knowledge she had accumulated throughout her struggle. She taught her students that justice is not just a theoretical concept, but an ongoing fight to correct the wrongs in society. Caroline Furrow had become a guest lecturer at national events, an inspiration, and an educator teaching fairness to the next generation of lawyers. Her voice resonated beyond the classroom, shaping the legal minds of tomorrow. Caroline Furrow was not just imparting knowledge. She was instilling a sense of responsibility to the law, urging students to never let bias cloud their judgment, just as she had once experienced firsthand. The change Caroline Furrow sparked didn't stop at an individual level. It spread throughout the entire Plasto court system. The first step in the reform was implementing independent monthly checks on sentencing to ensure that there was no favoritism or discrimination in the court's decisions. These checks were carried out by a team of independent legal experts who would review all verdicts, from the smallest cases to the most significant ones, to guarantee absolute fairness. In addition, a new ongoing training program was introduced, especially for judges and court staff. Lessons on bias and how to recognize prejudices in their work became an integral part of the training program. The Plasto court was no longer just a place for handling cases. It had become a space for learning and improving the system from the mistakes of the past. The community was also invited to be a part of this reform. Public feedback on cases showing signs of bias or discrimination was actively received and addressed. A community oversight system was established to ensure that no one in society was overlooked in the search for justice. The community could now see that their voices mattered and that they could help bring about change. The Plasto court was no longer a symbol of injustice. It had transformed into a testament to the fact that change is possible and that true justice could be restored from within. What started as a small act of defiance in a local courtroom had grown into a full-scale reform movement driven by the courage of one woman. Caroline Furrow's stand against injustice had not only changed her own life, but it had sparked a national conversation, inspired countless others to speak out, and ultimately redefined the way justice was pursued in Plasto and beyond. Through her actions, she proved that even the most entrenched systems of power could be challenged and eventually changed. In her office, Caroline Furrow framed the $500 receipt she had paid as a symbolic memento of the small revolution she had started. It wasn't just a fine, it was the price of justice, one she had paid in a seemingly insignificant moment. Yet, this fine had marked the beginning of a deep transformation within the legal system. The $500 receipt became a daily reminder for Caroline Furrow and everyone who visited her office that every major step forward begins with small actions. Justice is not something that is freely given. It must be fought for and defended. The receipt reminded her that no injustice, no matter how small, like being fined for being late, should go unchallenged. To every visitor, that receipt was more than just a decorative item. It stood as a symbol of resilience and an unrelenting fight for justice. Every day, Caroline Furrow looked at it and remembered the moment that changed her life and possibly the entire system. The receipt became a tangible representation of her struggle, reminding her that even the smallest acts of courage could ignite monumental change. After Caroline Furrow's story spread, letters began pouring into her office. hundreds from all walks of life, young lawyers, people who had suffered unjust fines, and students whose career trajectories had been completely altered by her courage and actions. These letters were not just simple thank yous. They were heartfelt stories of personal injustice, accounts of how the writers had suffered under the same biased system that Caroline Furrow had fought against. As Caroline Furrow read each letter, she realized that what she had done was not just a personal journey. It had sparked a movement. She was no longer fighting alone. Her actions had empowered others to rise up and demand change. One letter in particular struck Caroline Furrow deeply. It came from a young female lawyer who wrote that she had decided to pursue a career in law not just because of a love for the profession, but because she felt a deep responsibility to confront the systemic bias and injustice in the courtroom. "Caroline, you showed me that we can stand up against what is wrong," she wrote. "You gave me the courage to make a difference." Another letter read, "I've endured injustice for many years, but after seeing you stand up, I realized that I could change this. Thank you for teaching me that justice cannot be bought or silenced." These letters were more than words. They were fuel for Caroline Furrow's fire. They reinforced the idea that her actions had transcended her personal story and had ignited a larger movement. Her fight for justice was no longer just about her own case. It was about inspiring others to stand up for what was right, to make their voices heard in the face of systemic inequality. Looking back at everything that had happened, Caroline Furrow couldn't help but feel an overwhelming sense of pride. Her struggle wasn't just a knee-jerk reaction to a specific injustice. It marked the beginning of a new generation, one that was willing to stand up for justice and not remain silent in the face of bias. Caroline's actions had sparked a fire of hope for those who had been overlooked by the legal system, for those who had no voice, and for those who had been too scared to speak out, fearing that they would be crushed by the weight of authority. Thanks to her simple yet powerful act of courage, many people now realize that every voice could lead to change, and that even the smallest act of resistance could be the first step toward a larger reform. The change wasn't just within the legal system. Society itself began to evolve. Investigations and reforms from governmental bodies began to take shape. These changes weren't confined to the Plasto Court. They were being implemented across other courts and legal organizations nationwide. Young judges and lawyers became more aware of their role in maintaining justice, not just by applying the law mechanically, but by ensuring that every decision was fair and unbiased. And Caroline Furrow, who had stood up so bravely, had not only become the victor in that courtroom, but she had become a symbol of hope and change. She had proven that justice was not an abstract idea. It begins with individuals who dare to stand up to injustice, unafraid, unwavering. Caroline Furrow had shown the world that one person standing alone in the face of power could create a ripple effect that would transform the very fabric of a society. Thank you for staying with us through this incredible journey. Caroline Furrow's story is not just a testament to courage, but a reminder that one voice can spark a revolution. Her stand for justice has touched the hearts of many and inspired us all to challenge the injustices around us. We hope her story encourages you to stand tall, speak out, and always seek fairness in everything you do. If you found this story powerful and inspiring, don't forget to hit the subscribe button so you won't miss any of our upcoming stories filled with heart, truth, and moments of change. Your support means the world to us, and together, we can continue to spread the message of hope and justice. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.